Sarah Martinez had never imagined that serving coffee would change her life forever. At 24, she worked as a civilian contractor at Edwards Air Force Base in California, handling administrative duties and serving refreshments during high-level military briefings. Most people saw her as just another face in the background, someone who kept the coffee flowing and the meeting rooms organized. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at the base at 6 a.m. sharp, her security badge swaying against her khaki uniform as she walked through the main entrance. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and the distant rumble of aircraft engines warming up on the runway. She had grown accustomed to these sounds over the past 2 years of working at the base. Her supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, handed her the day's schedule. "Big briefing today, Sarah. Top brass from Washington will be here, along with some of our best test pilots. Make sure everything is perfect." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility. These weren't ordinary meetings. Edwards Air Force Base was home to some of the most advanced aircraft testing in the world, where experimental planes pushed the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. The briefings often involved classified information about new technologies that could reshape the future of flight. She spent the morning preparing the conference room in Building 1400, the secure facility where the most sensitive meetings took place. The room was windowless, with beige walls lined with security cameras and a large projection screen at the front. Sarah arranged the chairs in precise rows, checked the audio-visual equipment, and prepared the coffee station with military precision. The coffee setup was her specialty. She had learned that different ranks and branches of the military had their preferences. Air Force officers typically preferred stronger blends, while the civilian contractors usually went for something milder. Today's blend was a robust dark roast, chosen specifically for the high-stakes nature of the meeting. As she polished the silver coffee urns, Sarah caught her reflection in the metal surface. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, and her brown eyes showed the focus she brought to every task. But there was something else in her reflection that she rarely thought about. A small emblem sewn onto the sleeve of her work shirt. The emblem was barely 2 inches across, featuring an eagle with spread wings surrounded by stars and stripes. Most people assumed it was just another military contractor logo, but it held a much deeper meaning for Sarah. It represented her heritage, her family's service to their country, and a secret she had kept hidden from everyone at the base. Sarah's grandfather, Roberto Martinez, had been one of the first Mexican-American pilots in the U.S. Air Force during World War II. He had flown dangerous missions over Europe, earning several medals for his bravery. But his service had been largely overlooked by history, like many minority servicemen of his era. The emblem on Sarah's sleeve was actually a replica of his squadron patch, a tribute to his legacy that she wore every day. Her family had a proud tradition of military service. Her father had served in Vietnam, her uncle in the Gulf War, and her brother was currently deployed in Afghanistan. But Sarah had chosen a different path, using her administrative skills to support the military from behind the scenes. She told herself it was just as important, but sometimes she wondered if she was living up to her family's legacy. The briefing was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. By noon, Sarah had everything ready. The coffee was brewing, filling the room with its rich aroma. She had arranged fresh pastries and sandwiches on the side table, ensuring there would be plenty for the 30 attendees expected. At 1:30 p.m., people began arriving. Sarah recognized several faces from previous meetings. Colonel Davidson, a tall man with silver hair who ran the test pilot program, Dr. Rebecca Chen, the chief aeronautics engineer, and various other officers and civilian contractors. They filed in quietly, the weight of their work evident in their serious expressions. But then she saw him. Captain Michael Ace Thompson walked into the room with the confident stride that marked him as one of Edwards' most skilled test pilots. He was in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of his surroundings. Sarah had heard stories about him, how he had successfully tested 3 different experimental aircraft, each pushing the limits of speed and maneuverability. Captain Thompson had a reputation for being both fearless and incredibly observant. Other pilots joked that he could spot a loose rivet from a mile away. His attention to detail had saved his life more than once when flying untested aircraft that existed on the edge of what was aerodynamically possible. As the room filled with military personnel and contractors, Sarah moved quietly between them, offering coffee and ensuring everyone was comfortable. She had perfected the art of being helpful while remaining nearly invisible, a skill that served her well in these high-security environments. The meeting was called to order by General Patricia Hayes, a distinguished woman in her 50s who commanded respect from everyone in the room. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her ability to make quick decisions under pressure. Today's briefing would cover the latest test results from the X-47 experimental stealth aircraft program. Sarah positioned herself near the back of the room, ready to refill coffee cups or handle any other needs that might arise. She watched as classified charts and graphs appeared on the projection screen, detailing flight performance data that represented millions of dollars in research and development. Captain Thompson was seated in the third row, actively participating in the technical discussion. His questions were sharp and insightful, demonstrating his deep understanding of aircraft systems and flight dynamics. Sarah found herself impressed by his knowledge and the respect he clearly commanded from his colleagues. As the meeting progressed, Sarah noticed that several attendees were running low on coffee. She quietly began making her rounds, moving carefully between the chairs with a thermal carafe in hand. This was the delicate part of her job, providing service without disrupting the flow of important information. She had just finished refilling Colonel Davidson's cup when she approached Captain Thompson's row. He was leaning forward, studying a complex diagram on the screen that showed the X-47's stealth capabilities. Sarah moved to his left side, preparing to quietly refill his cup without disturbing his concentration. But as she reached for his coffee cup, something unexpected happened. Captain Thompson turned slightly in his chair, and his eyes fell directly on the small emblem sewn onto Sarah's sleeve. Captain Thompson's eyes widened as he focused on the emblem. The room continued its technical discussions around them, but for a moment time seemed to pause. Sarah noticed his reaction and felt a flutter of nervousness. She had always hoped the small patch would go unnoticed, but something about his expression told her he recognized its significance. He held up his hand slightly, a gesture that asked her to wait. Sarah froze, the coffee carafe still in her grip, unsure of what to do. The briefing continued around them, with General Hayes explaining the aerodynamic improvements that had been achieved in the latest test flights. Captain Thompson leaned back in his chair and whispered softly, "That's a 402nd Fighter Squadron patch." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The 442nd Fighter Squadron had been one of the most distinguished units of World War II, but it was also one that few people outside of military history knew about in detail. The fact that he recognized it immediately told her something important about this pilot. She nodded slightly, not trusting her voice. The 442nd had been her grandfather's unit, though she had never expected anyone to identify the emblem so quickly. Most people, even military personnel, would have assumed it was just another contractor logo, or perhaps a generic military symbol. "My grandfather," she whispered back, barely audible above the general's presentation about radar cross-section measurements. Captain Thompson's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, respect mixed with understanding. He gave her a small nod that conveyed more than words could express. In that brief exchange, Sarah realized that this pilot understood the weight of military legacy and the significance of family service. The meeting continued for another hour, covering technical specifications, test flight schedules, and safety protocols. Sarah completed her rounds, refilling coffee cups and maintaining her professional demeanor. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in that moment of recognition. When the briefing concluded, the attendees began filing out in small groups, discussing various aspects of what they had learned. Colonel Davidson was engaged in an animated conversation with Dr. Chen about engine performance parameters, while several junior officers clustered around General Hayes asking follow-up questions. Captain Thompson gathered his materials slowly, and Sarah noticed he was taking his time while others left the room. She began cleaning up the coffee station, stacking cups and wiping down surfaces, but she was acutely aware of his presence. As the room emptied, he approached her work area. Sarah looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Up close, she could see that his blue eyes held an intensity that spoke of someone who had faced danger and made split-second decisions at 30,000 feet. "Sarah Martinez," he said, reading her name tag. "That patch means something special to you." It wasn't a question. and Sarah appreciated that he didn't make her explain something so personal to a stranger. She nodded, continuing to pack up the coffee supplies. My grandfather flew with the 442nd in Europe, she said quietly. 23 missions. He was shot down over Germany in 1944 but made it back to Allied lines. Captain Thompson's expression grew more serious. The 442nd had some of the highest casualty rates in the European theater. Your grandfather was one of the lucky ones. Sarah was surprised by his knowledge. Most people, even within the military, knew little about the specific fighter. Squadrons from World War II. The 442nd Fighter Squadron had been largely overshadowed by more famous units in popular history. You seem to know a lot about World War II aviation history, Sarah observed. It's more than history for me, Captain Thompson replied. My great-uncle was a crew chief with the 99th Fighter Squadron. They worked closely with units like the 442nd during the Italian campaign. Sarah felt a connection forming. The 99th Fighter Squadron had been one of the famous Tuskegee Airmen units, the African-American pilots who had proven themselves in combat despite facing discrimination at home. Her grandfather had often spoken with respect about the skill and courage of the Tuskegee pilots he had served alongside. The Red Tails, Sarah said, using the nickname that had become famous decades later. Exactly. My great-uncle used to tell stories about those missions. He said the pilots from units like your grandfather's squadron were some of the finest he ever worked with. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding the significance of their family connections to that crucial period in aviation history. Sarah realized that Captain Thompson wasn't just making small talk. He genuinely understood and appreciated the legacy she carried with her. I've always wondered what it would have been like, Sarah said, surprising herself with the admission. Flying in combat, I mean. Testing your skills against impossible odds. Captain Thompson studied her carefully. What made you choose civilian contractor work instead of enlisting? It was a question Sarah had asked herself many times. She finished packing the last of the coffee supplies before answering. My family has given enough to the military, she said. 3 generations of service and my brother is still deployed. I thought I could contribute in other ways. But you're not satisfied with that choice, he observed. Sarah looked at him sharply. She hadn't expected such insight from someone she had just met. But there was something about Captain Thompson's directness that made her want to be honest. Sometimes, I wonder if I'm honoring my family's legacy or hiding from it, she admitted. Captain Thompson nodded as if he understood completely. I felt the same way before I became a pilot. My great-uncle's stories made flying sound both terrifying and essential. I wasn't sure if I was drawn to aviation because of family history or despite it. What changed your mind? I realized that the specific path doesn't matter as much as the commitment to excellence and service. Your grandfather flew combat missions. My great-uncle kept planes in the air under impossible conditions. What matters is that we both chose to serve something bigger than ourselves. Sarah felt something shift inside her. For 2 years, she had been content with her role as a support person, staying in the background and keeping things running smoothly. But Captain Thompson's words awakened something she had been trying to ignore. Have you ever thought about flight training? He asked. The question caught Sarah off guard. She had thought about it, of course. Growing up in a military family, she had been around aircraft her entire life. She had even taken some civilian flying lessons in college, discovering that she had natural instincts for piloting. I've thought about it, she said carefully, but test pilot programs are incredibly competitive and expensive. The military has programs for promising candidates, Captain Thompson said, especially candidates with the right background and motivation. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, with his name, rank, and contact information, but he also wrote something on the back before handing it to her. Think about it, he said. The aviation world needs people who understand legacy and responsibility. People who carry their family's service with them, not as a burden but as inspiration. Sarah took the card, feeling its weight despite the thin cardstock. She looked at what he had written on the back. Excellence through heritage. Your grandfather would be proud. As Captain Thompson prepared to leave, he turned back to her one more time. That patch you wear, he said, nodding toward her sleeve. Don't hide it. Wear it with pride. Some of us know what it really means. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the empty conference room, holding his business card and thinking about everything that had changed in the span of a single briefing. The emblem on her sleeve seemed to carry more weight now, as if Captain Thompson's recognition had awakened something that had been dormant. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment just outside the base, staring at Captain Thompson's business card. Her living room was modest but comfortable, with family photos covering one wall. The largest photo showed her grandfather in his World War II uniform, standing proudly next to a P-51 Mustang fighter plane. His smile was confident, the smile of a young man who had faced danger and emerged victorious. She had grown up hearing stories about Roberto Martinez, but they had always seemed like tales from another world. Her grandfather had died when she was 12, and by then, his war stories had taken on an almost mythical quality. He had been the family hero, the standard against which everyone else was measured. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. Maria Martinez answered on the second ring, her voice warm with the slight accent that reminded Sarah of her childhood. "Mija, how was your day?" "Mom, tell me again about Grandpa's squadron patch," Sarah said, settling back into her couch. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Why do you ask? You've heard those stories 100 times. I met someone today who recognized it. A test pilot. He knew immediately what it was." Her mother said, and Sarah could hear the understanding in her voice. "Your grandfather would have liked that. He always said that the real recognition came from other pilots, not from medals or ceremonies." Sarah looked at the photo on her wall. "Mom, was Grandpa ever scared?" "When he was flying missions? Of course he was scared, Mija. But he told me once that being scared wasn't the problem. The problem was letting fear make your decisions for you." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with her mother sharing details about Roberto's service that Sarah had never heard before. How he had been one of only a few Mexican-American pilots in his squadron. How he had faced discrimination both at home and overseas, but had proven himself through skill and determination. How he had earned the respect of his fellow pilots not through words but through actions. After hanging up, Sarah went to her computer and researched everything she could find about current Air Force pilot training programs. She discovered that there were several paths available, including programs specifically designed for civilian contractors who showed promise. The requirements were stringent: physical fitness, mental aptitude, educational background, but nothing that seemed impossible. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself paying closer attention to the aircraft operations at Edwards. During her lunch breaks, she would sit outside and watch the test flights, trying to imagine what it would be like to be at the controls of those experimental planes. The X-47 that had been discussed in the briefing was scheduled for more test flights, and she could see it being prepared on the distant runway. She also found herself noticing Captain Thompson around the base. He was always moving with purpose, either heading to briefings, conducting pre-flight inspections, or engaged in serious discussions with other pilots and engineers. There was something about his presence that commanded respect without demanding it. 3 days after their initial conversation, Sarah encountered him again in the base commissary. She was picking up supplies for an upcoming meeting when she saw him selecting items from the deli counter. He was wearing his flight suit, suggesting he had either just completed a mission or was preparing for one. "Sarah," he said, approaching her with a slight smile, "how are you settling in with that information I gave you?" "I've been doing research," she admitted, "looking into training programs and requirements." "And what did you find?" "That it's challenging but not impossible. The physical requirements are strict, and the academic workload is intense. But I think I could handle it." Captain Thompson nodded approvingly. "The question isn't whether you can handle the requirements. The question is whether you're ready to commit completely to the process." They walked together toward the checkout counter, their conversation continuing in the casual environment of the commissary. Sarah felt more comfortable talking with him here than she had in the formal setting of the briefing room. "What made you decide to become a test pilot specifically?" Sarah asked. "You could have chosen any aviation career path." "Test flying is where the future of aviation gets written," Captain Thompson explained. "Every new aircraft, every technological advancement, every safety improvement starts with test pilots willing to fly machines that have never been flown before. It's not about the glory. It's about pushing the boundaries of what's possible." Sarah understood. Test pilots weren't just skilled aviators. They were pioneers, explorers of the sky who ventured into uncharted territory with every flight. The aircraft they flew today would become the standard fighters, transports, and reconnaissance planes of tomorrow. My grandfather flew combat missions, Sarah said thoughtfully, but in some ways what you do might be even more dangerous. At least he knew his aircraft had been tested. Different kinds of risk, Captain Thompson agreed. Your grandfather faced a known enemy with proven weapons. Test pilots face the unknown with unproven machines. Both require the same fundamental qualities: skill, courage, and the ability to make good decisions under extreme pressure. As they reached the parking lot, Captain Thompson paused beside his truck. Sarah, can I ask you something personal? She nodded, curious about what he wanted to know. What does your family think about your interest in flying? Have you told them you're considering pilot training? Sarah hesitated. I haven't told them yet. I'm still trying to figure out if this is what I really want or if I'm just responding to meeting you and talking about Grandpa. That's honest, he said. But let me suggest something. This weekend there's an air show at March Air Reserve Base about 2 hours from here. It's open to the public, but it also includes some demonstrations of current test aircraft. Why don't you go? See if being around that environment feels right to you. Sarah considered the suggestion. She had been to air shows before, but always as a spectator enjoying the entertainment. Going now with the possibility of pilot training in mind would be different. Will you be there? She asked. I'm scheduled to fly a demonstration in the X-47. It's a public relations flight, showing off some of the capabilities we've been developing. The thought of seeing Captain Thompson in action, demonstrating the aircraft she had heard about in the briefing, was intriguing. But more than that, Sarah realized this would be an opportunity to see if she truly belonged in the world of military, aviation, or if she was just caught up in the excitement of possibility. I'll think about it, she said. Good. And Sarah, if you do decide to go, pay attention to how you feel when you see the aircraft flying. Don't think about it analytically. Just notice your gut reaction. That will tell you more about whether this is right for you than any amount of research or planning. That evening, Sarah called her brother Diego, who was stationed in Afghanistan. Despite the time difference and the challenges of international communication, she managed to reach him during his downtime. Little sister, his voice crackled through the connection. How's life in the civilian world? Diego, I need to ask you something important. Do you think I made the right choice not enlisting? Her brother was quiet for a long moment. In the background, Sarah could hear the distant sounds of military activity, vehicles, voices, the general buzz of a forward operating base. Sarah, you know I've never questioned your decision. Everyone serves in their own way. But what if I wanted to change that? What if I wanted to become a pilot? Are you serious? Diego's voice sharpened with interest. What brought this on? Sarah explained her encounter with Captain Thompson, the recognition of their grandfather's patch, and the conversations that had followed. Diego listened without interruption, letting her work through her thoughts out loud. You know what Grandpa used to tell me when I was thinking about enlisting? Diego finally said. He said that every generation has to find their own way to serve. His generation fought World War II. Dad's generation dealt with Vietnam. Mine is fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe your generation's service is in pushing the boundaries of what's possible in peacetime. Test pilot work, Sarah said, understanding his meaning. Exactly. And Sarah, you've always been the smartest one in the family. If anyone could handle the technical and physical demands of flight training, it's you. After the call, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about her future. For the first time, she could envision a path that would honor her family's legacy while also allowing her to forge her own identity. The March Air Reserve Base Airshow was unlike anything Sarah had experienced before. As she walked through the gates on Saturday morning, the roar of jet engines filled the air, and the smell of aviation fuel mixed with the excitement of thousands of spectators. Families with children pointed at static aircraft displays. Veterans shared stories with each other, and aviation enthusiasts photographed every detail of the military hardware on display. But Sarah wasn't there as a casual observer. She moved through the crowd with a different purpose, studying everything with the eye of someone who might soon be part of this world. The precision of the ground crews, the confident bearing of the pilots giving tours, the complex choreography of aircraft movements, all of it took on new meaning. She found a good vantage point near the flight line, where she could see the aircraft preparing for their demonstration flights. The X-47 that Captain Thompson would be flying was parked about 100 yards away, surrounded by technicians conducting pre-flight checks. Even stationary, it was an impressive machine, sleek, angular, and somehow both beautiful and intimidating. First time at a military air show? Sarah turned to find an elderly man standing beside her. He was wearing a baseball cap with USAF retired embroidered on it, and his weathered hands suggested decades of work around aircraft. Not exactly, Sarah said. But first time looking at it differently, the veteran studied her with sharp eyes that reminded her of her grandfather. You thinking about joining up? Maybe, pilot training. He nodded approvingly. Good. We need more young people who understand what service means. What's your background? Sarah told him about her work at Edwards, her family's military history, and her recent conversations with Captain Thompson. The veteran listened with the patience of someone who had mentored many young people over the years. Thompson's one of the good ones, he said when she mentioned the captain's name. I knew his great-uncle back in the day. Same dedication, same attention to detail. If he thinks you have potential, that means something. As they talked, the air show began. The first demonstration featured a formation of vintage World War II aircraft, including several P-51 Mustangs like the one her grandfather had flown. Sarah watched them with new understanding, imagining her grandfather at the controls of one of those powerful machines, facing enemy fighters over occupied Europe. But it was the modern military demonstrations that truly captured her attention. An F-22 Raptor performed a display that defied physics, climbing vertically and executing turns that seemed impossible. A C-17 transport demonstrated short-field landings and takeoffs that showcased the precision required for military logistics operations. Then came the announcement. For the X-47 demonstration, Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Captain Thompson's voice came over the public address system, explaining the capabilities of the experimental stealth aircraft. His tone was professional but engaging, clearly communicating complex technical information to a general audience. The X-47 represents the next generation of unmanned combat aircraft, his voice explained as the sleek plane taxied into position. But today's demonstration will be piloted manually to showcase the aircraft's handling characteristics and performance envelope. Sarah watched as the aircraft lined up on the runway. Even from a distance, she could see Captain Thompson in the cockpit, running through his final checks. The moment felt significant, not just because she was watching someone she knew perform at the highest levels of their profession, but because she was considering whether this could be her future. The X-47 accelerated down the runway with surprising speed, lifting off smoothly and climbing at an angle that demonstrated its powerful engines. Captain Thompson put the aircraft through a series of maneuvers that highlighted its agility and precision. Low-level passes showcased its stealth profile, while high-speed climbs demonstrated its performance capabilities. But what impressed Sarah most wasn't the aircraft's technology. It was the obvious skill and confidence of the pilot controlling it. Every movement was deliberate and precise, showing a mastery that came from years of training and experience. This wasn't just flying. It was artistry combined with technical expertise. That's what it looks like when someone finds their calling, the veteran beside her observed. Sarah realized he was right. Captain Thompson wasn't just operating an aircraft. He was demonstrating a perfect match between human capability and mechanical possibility. The X-47 responded to his inputs as if it were an extension of his own body, performing maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of both pilot and machine. As the demonstration concluded and Captain Thompson brought the aircraft in for a perfect landing, Sarah felt something click into place in her mind. The excitement, the precision, the sense of purpose. This was what she had been missing in her civilian contractor role. After the flying demonstrations ended, Sarah made her way to the area where pilots were meeting with the public. Captain Thompson was standing beside the X-47, still in his flight suit, answering questions from a group of fascinated spectators. She waited patiently until the crowd thinned out before approaching. That was incredible, she said simply. Captain Thompson smiled, the adrenaline from the flight still evident in his eyes. How did it feel to watch? Not the technical aspects, the emotional reaction. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Like I was watching something I was meant to be part of. That's what I hoped you'd say. Come on, let me show you something. He led her around to the other side of the aircraft, away from the crowds. Up close, the X-47 was even more impressive. Sarah could see the precision engineering in every surface, the careful attention to aerodynamic details that made high-performance flight possible. Put your hand on the fuselage, Captain Thompson instructed. Sarah placed her palm against the aircraft's skin. It was warm from the recent flight, and she could feel the slight vibrations as the engines wound down. What do you feel? He asked. Power, Sarah said immediately. Potential. Like it's alive somehow. That's the right answer. Aircraft aren't just machines. They're partnerships between human intelligence and engineering excellence. The best pilots understand that relationship. Captain Thompson opened a panel near the cockpit, revealing some of the complex avionics inside. This aircraft can fly itself, he explained. It has autopilot systems, computer-controlled flight surfaces, and navigation systems that are more precise than anything a human pilot could manage manually. Then why do you need pilots at all? Because computers can follow programming, but they can't adapt to situations that were never programmed. They can't make creative decisions or handle completely unexpected problems. That's where human judgment becomes essential. Sarah studied the cockpit, trying to imagine herself in the pilot's seat. The array of instruments and controls was intimidating but also exciting. Each switch and display represented a different aspect of flight control, a different way to interact with the aircraft's systems. Captain Thompson, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever doubt yourself? When you're flying something that's never been tested before, do you wonder if you're making the right decision? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. Every test pilot doubts themselves sometimes. But doubt isn't the problem, overconfidence is. Doubt keeps you careful, keeps you checking and double-checking everything. The key is not letting doubt paralyze you when it's time to act. As they walked back toward the crowd, Captain Thompson handed Sarah a folder he had been carrying. Flight training program applications, he explained. I took the liberty of picking up the paperwork you'd need. But Sarah, before you make any decisions, there's something else I want you to consider. What's that? Test pilot school isn't just about flying. It's about pushing boundaries, facing unknown risks, and accepting that every flight might teach us something that changes aviation forever. It's not a career, it's a calling. Make sure you understand the difference. That evening, Sarah drove back to her apartment with the application folder on her passenger seat. The air show had answered many of her questions about whether she belonged in military aviation, but it had also raised new ones about the level of commitment required. She spent the evening reading through the application materials. The requirements were comprehensive: physical fitness standards, educational requirements, psychological evaluations, and extensive background checks. The training program itself would be 18 months of intensive instruction, covering everything from basic flight training to advanced aerodynamics and test methodology. But what struck Sarah most was a paragraph, buried in the program description, about the heritage and responsibility of test pilots. It spoke about carrying forward the tradition of aviators who had pushed the boundaries of flight, from the Wright brothers to the current generation of experimental aircraft pilots. Reading those words, Sarah thought about her grandfather's service, her family's military tradition, and the emblem she wore on her sleeve every day. For the first time, she could see a clear connection between honoring that heritage and forging her own path forward. She picked up her phone and dialed Captain Thompson's number, which he had written on the folder. Sarah, he answered immediately. How are you processing everything from today? I want to apply, she said without hesitation. I want to become a test pilot. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could hear the smile in his voice when he responded. Then let's get started. But first we need to talk about what happens next and how we're going to get you prepared for the most challenging program the Air Force offers. The next 6 months transformed Sarah's life in ways she had never imagined. Captain Thompson had connected her with Lieutenant Colonel Janet Pierce, a former test pilot, who now ran the preparatory program for prospective aviators. Colonel Pierce was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had flown everything from fighters to experimental transports during her 20-year career. Thompson tells me you have potential, Colonel Pierce said during their first meeting. But potential means nothing if you're not willing to work harder than you've ever worked before. The preparatory program met 3 evenings a week and all day Saturday. Sarah found herself juggling her full-time contractor job with an intensive curriculum that covered aerodynamics, aircraft systems, meteorology, navigation, and flight physiology. The academic workload was demanding enough, but the physical preparation was even more challenging. Colonel Pierce had arranged for Sarah to train at the base fitness center with a group of current military personnel who were preparing for various specialized programs. The workouts were brutal: cardiovascular training, strength conditioning, and exercises designed to simulate the physical stresses of high-performance flight. "Your body needs to handle G-forces that can make you black out," explained Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the fitness instructor who had been assigned to Sarah's preparation. "We're going to build your tolerance gradually, but it's going to hurt." Sarah's evenings became a routine of study and physical training. She would finish her contractor duties at 5 p.m., grab a quick dinner, and then spend 3 hours either in classroom sessions or physical conditioning. By the time she got home each night, she was exhausted but exhilarated. Her family's reaction to her decision had been overwhelmingly positive. Her mother had cried when Sarah told her about the pilot training program, not from sadness but from pride. Her brother Diego had called from Afghanistan to offer encouragement and advice about military life. "You're finally following your heart instead of just following the safe path," he had told her. "Grandpa would be proud that you're taking risks for something you believe in." The most challenging part of the preparation wasn't the physical training or the academic coursework. It was learning to think like a pilot. Colonel Pierce spent considerable time helping Sarah understand the mindset required for aviation, especially test flying. "Every decision you make in an aircraft has consequences," Colonel Pierce explained during one of their mentoring sessions. "You need to develop the ability to process multiple variables simultaneously, while maintaining absolute focus on the primary mission." Sarah discovered that her years of working in high-pressure briefing environments had actually prepared her well for this aspect of aviation. She was already comfortable making quick decisions with incomplete information and maintaining composure under stress. Captain Thompson continued to serve as an informal mentor. Throughout her preparation period, he would occasionally take time to discuss specific aspects of test flying that weren't covered in the formal curriculum. These conversations often took place during brief encounters around the base, but they provided Sarah with insights into the real-world application of what she was learning. "The textbooks teach you the theory," he explained during one such conversation, "but test flying is about responding to situations that the textbooks never anticipated. You need to develop intuition based on solid fundamentals." As Sarah's application progressed through the Air Force bureaucracy, she underwent a series of evaluations that tested every aspect of her readiness for pilot training. The medical examinations were exhaustive, checking not just her physical health but her tolerance for the unique stresses of flight. The psychological evaluations assessed her decision-making abilities, stress tolerance, and emotional stability under pressure. One of the most challenging parts of the process was the flight aptitude testing. Although Sarah had some civilian flying experience, the military evaluation standards were far more rigorous. She spent several sessions in flight simulators that tested her spatial awareness, hand-eye coordination, and ability to multitask under simulated emergency conditions. The simulator sessions were eye-opening. Sarah discovered that while she had good natural instincts for flying, she still had much to learn about operating in the complex environment of military aviation. The scenarios involved multiple aircraft, radio communications, weather considerations, and mechanical emergencies that required split-second decision-making. "You're thinking too much," observed the evaluation pilot after one particularly challenging simulation. "Good pilots learn to trust their training and respond instinctively. Overthinking can be just as dangerous as not thinking at all." Sarah took this feedback seriously, working to develop the confidence to act decisively, even when she didn't have complete information. This was perhaps the biggest mental shift from her contractor work, where careful analysis and deliberation were valued above quick action. 3 months into her preparation, Sarah received notification that her application had been accepted for the next phase of evaluation. This meant traveling to the Air Force's Flight Training Assessment Center for a week-long battery of tests that would determine her final acceptance into pilot training. The night before she left for the assessment, Captain Thompson stopped by her apartment to wish her luck. It was the first time he had seen her outside of the base environment, and Sarah was slightly nervous about the informal setting. "How are you feeling about the assessment?" he asked as they sat on her small balcony, looking out at the lights of Edwards Air Force Base in the distance. "Nervous," Sarah admitted, "but also excited. I've worked so hard to get to this point that I can't imagine not being selected. That's the right attitude. But remember, even if something unexpected happens with your application, the preparation you've done has already changed you. You're not the same person who was serving coffee 6 months ago. Sarah knew he was right. The training had transformed not just her physical capabilities, but her entire sense of self. She carried herself with more confidence, approached challenges with greater determination, and felt connected to a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life. Captain Thompson, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't become a pilot? If you had chosen a different path? He considered the question carefully. I think everyone wonders about alternative paths, but I've learned that you can't live your life looking backward. The key is making the best decision you can with the information you have, and then committing completely to that choice. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching aircraft lights move across the night sky. Sarah felt a sense of calm that surprised her, given the importance of the upcoming assessment. There's something I want you to remember during the evaluation, Captain Thompson said finally. They're not just testing your flying ability or your technical knowledge. They're evaluating whether you have the character and judgment to be trusted with million-dollar aircraft and potentially dangerous missions. How do I demonstrate that? By being authentic. Don't try to be what you think they want to see. Be the person who honored her grandfather's legacy by choosing to serve, who worked harder than anyone expected to prepare for this opportunity, and who understands that becoming a pilot is about more than personal achievement. The next morning, Sarah boarded a commercial flight to the assessment center with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. As the plane climbed through the clouds, she looked down at the ground receding below and imagined herself at the controls of a military aircraft, preparing for a test flight that would push the boundaries of what was possible. The week ahead would determine whether her dream of becoming a test pilot would become reality or remain an unfulfilled aspiration. But regardless of the outcome, Sarah knew that Captain Thompson had been right. She was no longer the same person who had been carrying coffee just 6 months earlier. She was someone who had chosen to pursue excellence, to honor her family's legacy of service, and to commit herself to something larger than her own comfort and security. The emblem on her sleeve had become more than a tribute to her grandfather's memory. It had become a symbol of her own determination to earn her place among the aviators who pushed the boundaries of flight. As the assessment center came into view below, Sarah felt a surge of confidence. She had prepared as thoroughly as possible, and now it was time to prove that she belonged in the cockpit of the world's most advanced aircraft. The assessment center was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Located at a sprawling facility in Texas, it housed some of the most advanced flight simulation equipment in the world. The buildings were modern and sterile, designed purely for function rather than aesthetics. Everything about the environment communicated seriousness and precision. Sarah was part of a group of 24 candidates, representing the cream of applicants from across the country. Some were recent college graduates with aviation degrees, others were current military personnel seeking to transition to pilot roles, and a few, like Sarah, were civilian contractors who had demonstrated exceptional potential. The first day began with comprehensive briefings about the assessment process. Colonel Michael Harris, the center's commanding officer, addressed the group with characteristic military directness. Over the next week, we will evaluate every aspect of your readiness for pilot training, he announced. Physical capabilities, mental acuity, decision-making under pressure, leadership potential, and character. Some of you will be selected for pilot training. Others will not. The process is fair, but it is not forgiving. The evaluations began immediately. Physical fitness testing pushed each candidate to their limits, measuring not just current capability, but potential for improvement under the physical stresses of flight training. Sarah's months of preparation paid off as she completed each challenge with confidence, her scores placing her in the top quarter of the group. The academic testing was equally demanding. Complex scenarios requiring rapid analysis and decision-making, mathematical calculations that had to be performed under time pressure, technical questions about aircraft systems, weather patterns, and emergency procedures. Sarah found herself drawing on everything she had learned during her preparation, but also relying on intuitive understanding she had developed through her exposure to military aviation at Edwards. But it was the flight evaluations that truly mattered. Each candidate would spend several hours in advanced simulators that replicated the experience of flying high-performance military aircraft. The scenarios were designed to test not just flying ability, but judgment, adaptability, and performance under stress. Sarah's first simulator session was in a replica of a T-6 Texan trainer, the aircraft used for initial military flight training. As she strapped into the cockpit and began the pre-flight checklist, she felt a moment of profound connection to her grandfather's memory. He had learned to fly an aircraft not much different from this one, preparing for combat missions over Europe. The evaluation pilot, Major Lisa Chen, observed silently as Sarah completed her checks and prepared for takeoff. The simulator was incredibly realistic, complete with engine sounds, instrument responses, and motion that replicated the sensation of actual flight. "Take us up to 3,000 feet and level off," Major Chen instructed as Sarah advanced the throttle and began her takeoff roll. The aircraft responded smoothly to Sarah's inputs, climbing steadily as she monitored airspeed, altitude, and engine parameters. She found herself falling into a natural rhythm, making small adjustments to maintain precise control while monitoring multiple instruments simultaneously. "Emergency scenario," Major Chen announced suddenly. "Engine failure at altitude. Execute emergency procedures." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She lowered the nose to maintain airspeed, identified a suitable landing area, and began running through the emergency checklist. Her movements were deliberate and precise, demonstrating the calm decision-making that was essential for military aviation. "Good," Major Chen said as Sarah successfully completed the emergency landing simulation. "Now let's see how you handle formation flying." The simulator environment changed to include other aircraft, requiring Sarah to maintain precise positioning while navigating through complex airspace. This was one of the most challenging aspects of military flying, operating in close proximity to other aircraft while maintaining safety and mission effectiveness. Sarah discovered that her months of preparation had given her not just technical knowledge, but the confidence to trust her abilities under pressure. When unexpected challenges arose during the simulation, she found herself responding instinctively rather than overthinking each decision. After 3 hours in the simulator, Major Chen shut down the systems and turned to Sarah with an expression that revealed nothing about her performance. "How do you think you did?" the Major asked. "I felt comfortable with the aircraft handling and emergency procedures," Sarah replied honestly. "The formation flying was challenging, but I think I maintained acceptable positioning throughout the scenarios." "What would you do differently if you could repeat the evaluation?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think I was initially too cautious with control inputs. Military aircraft are designed to handle aggressive maneuvering, and I needed to be more assertive with my flying." Major Chen made notes on her evaluation form without comment, leaving Sarah to wonder whether her self-assessment had been accurate. The week continued with increasingly complex evaluations, leadership exercises that tested Sarah's ability to make decisions for a team under pressure, psychological interviews that probed her motivations and mental resilience, medical examinations that verified her ability to handle the unique stresses of high-performance flight. One of the most challenging evaluations was a scenario-based exercise where candidates had to work together to solve complex problems under time pressure. Sarah found herself naturally taking on a coordination role, helping to organize the team's efforts and ensure that all aspects of the problem were addressed systematically. During this exercise, she worked closely with another candidate named Lieutenant Marcus Williams, a current Air Force officer who was seeking to transition from transport aircraft to fighters. Marcus had noticed the emblem on Sarah's sleeve during the first day of evaluations, and they had talked briefly about their family's military service. "You're thinking like a test pilot," Marcus observed as they worked through a particularly complex scenario involving multiple aircraft systems failures. "You're not just trying to solve the immediate problem. You're trying to understand what caused it and how to prevent it in the future." Sarah realized he was right. Her approach to problem-solving had evolved during her preparation period, moving beyond simply following procedures to understanding the underlying principles that made those procedures effective. On the final day of evaluations, each candidate participated in a comprehensive interview with a panel of senior officers. This was the opportunity to demonstrate not just technical competence, but the character and judgment that were essential for military aviation. Colonel Harris led the interview panel, along with Major Chen and two other senior pilots whose experience spanned decades of military aviation. The questions covered everything from Sarah's motivation for seeking pilot training to hypothetical scenarios that tested her ethical decision-making. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Harris began, "you've chosen an unusual path to pilot training. Most candidates come to us directly from college or from enlisted military service. What makes you confident that you can succeed in this environment?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared her answer carefully. But as she sat facing the panel, she realized that her prepared response wasn't what she really wanted to say. "Colonel, 6 months ago I was serving coffee at briefings and staying in the background," she said. "I told myself that I was contributing to the mission, but I wasn't really challenging myself or living up to my potential. Meeting Captain Thompson and recognizing the significance of my grandfather's legacy made me realize that I had been choosing safety over purpose." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I can't promise that I'll be the best pilot in my class or that I'll never make mistakes, but I can promise that I'll approach every challenge with the same dedication my grandfather showed when he flew combat missions over Europe. I want to be part of pushing the boundaries of what's possible in aviation, not just supporting others who do that work." The panel asked several follow-up questions, but Sarah could see in their expressions that her answer had resonated. When the interview concluded, Colonel Harris stood and shook her hand. "Ms. Martinez, you'll receive notification of our decision within 2 weeks. Regardless of the outcome, you should be proud of your performance here this week." The flight home to California felt different from her arrival a week earlier. Sarah was exhausted from the intensive evaluations, but she also felt a sense of completion. She had given her best effort and demonstrated everything she had learned during months of preparation. Captain Thompson was waiting for her when she arrived back at Edwards. He had volunteered to pick her up from the airport, and Sarah was grateful for the familiar face after the intensity of the assessment week. "How was it?" he asked as they drove back toward the base. "Challenging but fair," Sarah replied. "I think I performed well, but the competition was intense. Everyone there had earned their place through exceptional preparation and natural ability. Did you feel like you belonged?" Sarah considered the question as they passed the familiar landmarks around Edwards. "Yes," she said finally. "For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." 2 weeks later, Sarah was working at her contractor job when she received the call she had been waiting for. Colonel Harris's voice was formal but warm as he delivered the news that would change her life forever. "Ms. Martinez, on behalf of the United States Air Force, I'm pleased to inform you that you have been selected for pilot training. Your class begins in 8 weeks." After hanging up the phone, Sarah sat quietly at her desk for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. She looked down at the emblem on her sleeve, her grandfather's squadron patch, that had started this entire journey, and felt a connection across the decades to the young man who had faced enemy fighters over wartime Europe. Captain Thompson found her later that afternoon, having heard the news through official channels. His smile was broad as he approached her desk. "Congratulations, future pilot," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud." Sarah looked around the briefing room where she had served coffee just months earlier, remembering the moment when Captain Thompson had recognized the significance of her family's legacy. That encounter had changed everything, setting in motion a series of events that had transformed her from a background support person into someone preparing to push the boundaries of aviation. "Captain Thompson," she said, "I never properly thanked you for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself." "I didn't see anything that wasn't already there," he replied. "I just helped you recognize it. Now the real work begins. Pilot training will be the most challenging thing you've ever done." Sarah nodded, understanding that her journey was just beginning. But as she looked ahead to the months of intensive training that awaited her, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She was no longer the person who had been carrying coffee at briefings. She was someone who had chosen to honor her family's legacy by pursuing excellence, and who was prepared to earn her place among the aviators who pushed the boundaries of what was possible in flight. The emblem on her sleeve would soon be joined by pilot's wings, marking her transition from supporter to participant in the ongoing story of military aviation. And somewhere in that transformation, Sarah had discovered not just a new career, but her true calling.